What if I told you that I could identify some of the most valuable people inside your organization without ever meeting them? What if I told you that your organization is sitting on massive amounts of data about its people that isn't even being used? Well, I'm about to tell you that and get into that. But first, I want to share with you a couple of the things that I find most fascinating when I want to study people, which is studying people on social media. So these are a couple of my favorite social media accounts. This is something called Breadface Blog. This is a woman who simply smushes her face into pieces of bread. And it's very popular. She has a lot of different followers of people who just want to watch her smush her face into different pieces of bread, and it's something out there. There's another platform that some of you may be familiar with called Nextdoor, which is a community-based social network where you can talk with your neighbors. And there's a Twitter account called Best of Nextdoor, which showcases some of the funniest things that people share. So, for example, there's a gentleman who wants to discuss the JFK assassination monthly with friends in his neighborhood. There is someone who wants to warn her neighbors that the avocados at Whole Foods are rock hard. And there is someone who is very concerned about a suspicious baby boomer wandering around the neighborhood. And then perhaps my very favorite social media account is an Instagram account called Dr. Pimple Popper. So, yeah, I've censored the videos because, quite frankly, I think they're revolting, but 3.2 million people don't think they're revolting. And they watch this all the time. In fact, this account got so popular that TLC, the Learning Channel, created a TV show for Dr. Sandra Lee called Dr. Pimple Popper that follows her clinic and follows the different patients that she studies. So obviously, when I found out that this was going to be a thing, I was like, I have to tune into this show and see what it's all about. And so I watched a recent episode, and it's fascinating, actually. So there was a patient who came in who had this weird kind of skin flap on her back. And it's actually, very serious, right? Dr. Lee helps out her patients tremendously. And so she has a pretty standard process about how she goes about doing this. The first thing she does is she surveys the patient, right? How long have you had this skin flap? What is your pain level? What does it look like? And she surveys the area. Based on that, she felt pretty confident that this was a common issue that she could snip off. But the second thing Dr. Lee always does is she does the lab work. She sends for lab work. In this case, it was an MRI and a blood test to try to understand more about what was actually happening with this patient. And despite the fact that her hypothesis was that this was a very simple issue, the lab work showed that this patient actually had a very rare condition in which her spinal cord had fused to the skin, and so a normal procedure was not going to be possible. But if she was just reliant on the survey, she wouldn't know that. It was only through the lab work that she got that information. I'd like to call survey data surface data. This is the data that's easiest to collect, the data on the surface, the data that we most frequently will look at when we're trying to make decisions. But the lab work represents buried data. This is the data that's often very hard to collect, often can be more expensive to collect, and oftentimes we don't go the distance to get, but that gives us the real insights when we're trying to make a decision. You can think of this a little bit like a dandelion flower, right? Where you have the flower above the surface, representing that surface data, and then you have below the surface the buried data and the roots. And when we want to make decisions, it's important to make sure that we're not just using surface data, but that we're going that extra mile to try to find that buried data. And I'll say in the world that I live in, which is understanding people inside organizations, I feel like we're still doing a woefully poor job at doing that. And I want to share about how I think we can start to do that a little bit better. I used to work for a really, really big company, a company that every one of you has one of their products at home. And I was leading a culture change initiative that was focused on how do we support people from a grassroots perspective, help people to advance new ideas, new thinking. And it was going really well. It was actually a very successful initiative. But I wanted to collect some data to help show that and help get more support and more money and all that good stuff to keep doing the work. And so I did what most of us do when we want to get some data. I created a survey and sent it out. And then I did the other thing we do when we create a survey is I sat in the back of SurveyMonkey, like madly refreshing, to see what the responses were and watch as they come in. And eventually, right, with enough poking and prodding and Starbucks gift cards and everything, shy of blatantly shaming people, I was able to get enough data. And I was able to create the report with, all the nice graphs and the upward trajectory and all the stuff that we want to do when we want support for something, and was able to get that support, which was great. But when I started to look to the data to help me think about how might I do some things a little bit differently, how might I do these things better, I found that the data weren't very valuable to do that. Because, you see, what I had collected was just that surface data, right? Self-report data, as we know, is inherently flawed and not super reliable. And so I started to think, well, what would represent buried data in the context of our workplace? How could you do the lab work when you're trying to understand people and how they work when they're showing up every day inside our organizations? And so it got me to thinking, well, so much of our work these days is digital, right? We spend so much of our time using different tools and different applications to be able to get our work done. We spend time in various different communications tools, email, Slack, Yammer, these types of things, right? We spend time in various different functional tools like SAP or Salesforce or Workday. We spend time in different collaboration tools, Skype, Zoom, GoToMeeting. We spend time in creation tools, Word, Excel, PowerPoint. We spend a lot of time in tools. In fact, a recent study by Harman.ie found that the average employee in a workplace now uses 11 different tools on any given day to get her work done. Another study by Symantec found that CIOs, chief information officers, thought that across the board inside their organizations, employees probably use something like 30 different tools to get work done. What that same study found is that while the CIOs thought that organizations were using about 30 tools total, it's actually the average organization uses 928 different tools and applications to do work. In 2019, 928 different tools that different people are using to get work done. And so that is a heck of a lot of data. That's a massive amount of data. And when I started thinking about how we use these tools and how we work with these tools, they could be an interesting source of buried data for us to start to really understand more about how people work. And so I started thinking, how might we actually look to some of that to understand people better? And it's not about actually looking at the work product or what people do inside the tool, but it's about looking at the metadata that's behind the tools. So metadata is just data about data. It's essentially the breadcrumbs that get left behind when we use a different application that show when we accessed it, with whom did we access it, for how long were we accessing it, some different things like that. And I thought, well, maybe looking at some of those data can help us understand a little bit better how people work and the types of ways that they work inside the organization. And so going back to my use case, right, of wanting to understand what was happening with this culture change initiative, I started looking at the back end of some of the different community tools that we were using. And I started looking at things like, who are the people who were actively commenting on content or engaging with content? Who are the people who were actively participating in different events or organizing different events? And I assembled that kind of stuff and put it into some, fancy dashboard type stuff that could show me a little bit more about who were the people who were really engaged across the organization. And I could overlay that with geographic data as well to see, if I wanted to roll out a new program in Brazil, who were the most engaged people in Brazil, and I could work with them directly to work to do it. And work to understand just more about exactly what was going on inside the organization. And most importantly, by starting to use these data, I was able to find Donna. So Donna has since become like my hero, like I love Donna, but Donna is somebody who was relatively unknown inside our company. She had actually been at the company for 30 years. She had an office in literally one of the basements of one of our office buildings. She's the kind of stalwart employee that was not very flashy, not very loud about how she did her work, but based on her digital footprint, I could see this is someone who is well connected throughout the organization, who has a lot of interesting ideas, works to make things better without being asked, and is someone who actually could benefit from being showcased and having a platform to share more of what she wants to do. And so by giving her that platform and allowing her to share, Donna actually became a celebrity in the company. She shared a new way of thinking about how we do clinical trials that changed the way people thought about doing clinical trials across the whole organization. And the cool thing about that is that's just one Donna. And there are a lot of Donnas inside the organizations, a lot of people that can benefit from that kind of amplification when we find them and support them and are intentional about going out and giving them the kind of platform needed to be able to become more successful. Now, I'm not naive about what it means to start looking at some of these types of data. Because just because our intention is to advocate for and support employees better, it can often be the case that when we start using data, we can have unintentional consequences as we start to do that. And so it's really important to think about exactly how we do that. And so essentially for the last year, I've been studying just that. And I've been working inside a lot of different types of organizations to unbury buried data and understand what are the use cases in which we can really advocate for and support talent that is not getting the support that it needs, and how do we make sure to do that most responsibly. Because for how many of you have you ever been passed up for a job promotion? Or have you ever had a boss who didn't listen to you? Or have you ever not been engaged in something that like, if they had just listened to me, it would have been different, right? And so it's really important to think about how we combat those types of situations. So the first scenario that I think this is really interesting in is around talent selection. So oftentimes in an organization, when we're looking for somebody for an open job, we're looking for somebody to be part of a development program, or we're looking for somebody to help drive a change initiative, we might be dependent upon the people who apply for that or the people who are nominated for that. But what happens is that can over-index on extroverts, that can over-index on different things that aren't exactly who we want to look for. But when we look to the buried data, when we look to the metadata, we can start to look at things like, who are people who are well-connected with people outside their function or work group? Who are people who are most frequently asked to give feedback to their colleagues? Who are people who are active in social intranets? You know, all these different kinds of things that depending on who we're looking for, we can look for the specific type of profile of that individual and make sure that we're supporting the right kind of people into the right kind of places. The second use case that's really interesting is around employee engagement. So these are words that get tossed around now ad nauseum, right? And there are dozens of different survey tools that are focused on asking very well thought out questions at very well thought out time intervals to try to assess engagement. But there's a difference between whether or not people say they're engaged and whether they're actually engaged. And so that surface data isn't always super valuable compared to what we can get when we start to look at the buried data. And the other thing that what happens when we think about engagement now is we tend to think about it as a one-size-fits-all approach, when the reality is different employees want to be engaged in different ways. And when we look at more data, we can start to create talent clusters and think about how do we engage people in the way that makes the most sense for them. The third use case that I think is really interesting is around what I call whole house talent management. So in many organizations, there might be a person or a group that's focused on talent management. But really what they tend to be focused on is executive management. And they're focused on the very top slice of the organization. And now, given that the talent management process is a very data-poor, high-touch process, it makes sense that they start at, who's ready now, ready future for CEO, C-suite roles, those very important roles. But when we can bring more data to the conversation, we can really be thinking about everyone in the organization. And we don't have to neglect people lower down in the organization. They can be considered, respected, and valued as well. There's this saying that everywhere the quantitative devours the qualitative. And given that talent has historically been such a qualitative field, it's been really hard to go into. But when we start to look at more data, we can start to quantify qualities that have historically been intangible and unquantifiable, and some of those corporate citizenship type traits that we know are really important of employees who make things better without being asked, or internal thought leaders and consultants who do the kind of things that maybe they historically didn't get rewarded for. We can start to reward for that kind of behavior now more appropriately. Now, all of those scenarios are kind of what I call these man behind the curtain scenarios, right? Those are examples of leaders, executives, looking at data to help support people. But what are really interesting are the scenarios where you're giving an employee direct access to her data in a way that managers and executives aren't even looking at. For example, imagine getting a personal productivity dashboard that shows, hey, you always accept this meeting invite, but on average you send 6 emails during that meeting. Are you sure you want to keep going? And, right? And getting the mirror up to yourself to think about how you work. Because oftentimes how we work is a crisis in and of itself. And given that what we measure we improve, think about the value to the organization when we start to be more intentional about those kinds of things. And the great thing about that example is that's data that can be just for the employee. The manager doesn't have to, it's not something that the manager should see for evaluative purposes or for punitive purposes. It's just for an employee to think critically about how do I work, how might I work differently, and how might I work better. Now, the next logical question when it comes to any of this is really thinking about, as an employee, what are my data rights? And how should we be thinking about making decisions when it comes to using the power of this data really responsibly? You know, in the immortal words of Ian Malcolm in Jurassic Park, yeah, but the scientists were so preoccupied with whether or not they could, they didn't stop to think if they should, right? And so it's a really important question to ask, should we and how should we use these data? Because we need to be really intentional about it. We've seen the corrosive effects of firms like Cambridge Analytica and what can happen when Facebook's data is weaponized to undermine democracy and all the different horrible things that have happened in the outside world when data gets misused and abused. And so the last thing that we want to do is create Cambridge Analytica inside our workplaces. And so it's just because we know how bad it can get in the rest of the world that we need to start to be really intentional about shaping what we want it to be like inside our workplaces. A woman from the London School of Economics, Manoush Shafiq, said recently, in the past, jobs were about muscles. Now they're about brains. But in the future, they'll be about heart. And that is really the core issue when we start to think about any of this kind of AI or machine learning or anything that's taking something as complex as a person and trying to transmit information about that into a stream of data. And so we need to be really intentional and really smart about how we shape this path forward. In all of the use cases that I mentioned earlier, it was a matter of first starting with really clear data governance and ethical decision-making around a diverse group of people deciding we will use these data for only these explicit purposes, and if we ever want to use it for something different, we need to go back and make those decisions. Inside your organizations, what are the data governance policies now? Who has access to these data? Who's making those decisions? Is it being done with great intention? Because in many organizations, it's really just on the default mode, and you would be surprised how many people can go in and look at some of this kind of information. And so it's really imperative that we start thinking smarter about this, and that we start being more intentional about how we shape this path forward. The reality is that there are Donnas in all of our organizations. You might be a Donna. You might be someone who could benefit from being unburied and amplified and supported and given more of an opportunity to be showcased. And so if we can use data to help to make that process smoother and to help to find and support you, then we should. But we need to do it the right way, and we need to do it responsibly. When we think about the future that we want to create in our workplaces, and when we think about our number one responsibility as leaders, it is about supporting talent and advocating for talent. And so we need to go about it the right way. Think about in your organization the talent challenges that you have. Think about the surface data that you might be using to address them now. And think about what buried data you might use to start to address it a little bit differently. Because in a big data world, surface data is not enough. And when we start using this buried data, we can find that talent is everywhere if we just know where to look. Thank you.